Organized crime has long held a mystique, partly fueled by Hollywood's portrayal in movies such as Goodfellas, The Untouchables, Casino, and The Irishman. These films highlight famous mobsters and criminal syndicates, shaping our understanding of the mafia. However, America harbors many lesser-known, yet equally powerful, criminal syndicates. These groups, often labeled as mafiosi or mafias, operate under strict codes of secrecy, profitability, and power maintenance through corruption. While the New York and Chicago families saw their influence wane in the 1980s, which started during the 50s, a new form of criminal organization emerged during the mid-50s, particularly within prison walls. Syndicates from Mexico, Latin America, and the southern United States gained significant power. These groups, including the Dixie Mafia, orchestrated their operations both behind bars and on the streets, maintaining an iron grip on their enterprises through secrecy and corruption. The Dixie Mafia, a criminal organization with roots in the American South, exemplifies this secretive and dangerous world. Unlike the more famous northern families, the Dixie Mafia thrived by leveraging political corruption and violence. They were known for their brutal tactics, which included targeting politicians, lawyers, judges, and even senators. Their reach extended far beyond the streets and deep into the corridors of power. At the heart of the Dixie Mafia was Kirksey McCord Nix Junior, born 1943, a man whose criminal career encapsulates the syndicate's ruthless efficiency. Nix's notoriety began with his suspected involvement in the assassination attempt on Sheriff Buford Pusser and the murder of Pusser's wife on August 12, 1967. Despite repeated accusations, Nix has consistently refused to comment on Pusser's claims. Nix's criminal activities did not end there. In 1972, he was convicted of murdering Frank Corso, a New Orleans grocery executive, during a break-in at Corso's home. This conviction led to Nix serving a life sentence without parole. Even behind bars, Nix continued to exert influence over the Dixie Mafia, orchestrating operations and maintaining control over the syndicate. The Dixie Mafia's operations highlight a crucial aspect of modern organized crime: the ability to run extensive criminal enterprises from within prison walls. This adaptability has allowed the syndicate to maintain its grip on power, ensuring its profitability and longevity. The group's leaders, like Nix, use their time in prison to solidify their control, manage their affairs, and direct their subordinates. When I first started my channel, I wanted to explore various organized crime structures, especially the powerful syndicates in the southern United States. These groups, including the Southern Mafia and other organized crime organizations in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas, wielded immense power. What made them so formidable was the symbiotic bond between these groups. They understood their roles and shared core values: respect, power, and capability. Respect was crucial, power was essential, and the ability to handle political corruption was a must. This article delves into the dynamics of these crime groups, showcasing their strength and influence during that era. They say it was Dixie Mafia killers who poured lighter fluid all over the shot-dead body of Jack Howard Joy and set it on fire, black smoke curling up fast from the ditch where it lay. The smell was like barbecue, someone said, only sweeter. This happened in Louisiana, the same place poor Margie George took a hatchet blow in the head for refusing to open a safe they wanted cracked. Later, she took a bullet when it seemed she wasn't dying fast enough. Dewey D'Angelo, now you'd think a fellow who owned a strip joint in Biloxi, Mississippi, and ran drugs could afford a little protection. But they got him all right. They got him and sliced his ear off and made him chew on it, there in the trunk of his beautiful Lincoln Continental. "Dewey," they told him, "this is your last act." And then they carved a long, smiling hunk out of his neck and added 8 more jabs for good measure. Such tales of the Dixie Mafia had long circulated around the Deep South when I was a boy growing up in Louisiana. The papers regularly carried stories of the goings-on across the state line in Mississippi. In Biloxi, members of the gang engaged in bloody fratricide, routinely slaughtering each other. I imagined men with pock-marked faces, gold-capped teeth and hair slicked back with oil, white trash, all who inhabited safe houses and lurked in dimly lit precincts where proper people didn't visit. I imagined big cars and Tommy guns and fast, fleshy women in push-up bras and garter belts. Never did I dream that Dixie mafiosi might move in circles like my own, swinging for the long ball at Sunday afternoon softball games, sitting attentively at town council meetings, or slurping Kool-Aid at church picnics. It would have been hard to square those moments of small-town respectability with the stories the papers carried and the stories that I heard. Two things about our southern fried version of the syndicate were apparent. One, when they bothered to murder somebody, the crime was going to be spectacular. And two, judging from Joy and D'Angelo, they took especially good care of their own. The city from which all this good care arose was Biloxi, which the Dixie Mafia has always called home. That much is for certain, although figuring out just when random crimes and assorted criminals became organized isn't. The FBI thinks that it happened in the late 1940s and describes the mob as a loose confederation of traveling criminals who operate from Florida to Texas, committing everything from confidence and pigeon-drop swindles to bank robberies, prostitution, and murder for hire. In Biloxi, the mafiosi found waterfront hotels that commanded scenic views, beaches long and white, and gasoline always a few cents cheaper than in the bigger cities to the north. They found a peaceful, clannish sort of place, standing hard by the Gulf of Mexico, houses everywhere 150 years old. People say that if you step on a toe on the east end of town, a scream can be heard way over on the west end. Jefferson Davis, defeated president of the Confederacy, chose this town to retire in. Biloxi, even then, was a place proud and loyal to its southern sons, no matter the fool error and ignoble effects of their ways. Not long ago, on a warm blue evening, the Dixie Mafia paid a call to Biloxi's high society. They came on a night rich with supper smells and the Gulf's salty perfume, and by the time they were finished, 2 more names were added to the mob's long roster of thoroughly dead Southerners. This is how Lynn Sposito sees it, how it comes to her sometimes now like a powder flash, bright and awful, carrying a high yellow stink. There's her father, Vincent Sherry Junior, lying on the sofa in the family room of his home in Biloxi's Ancient Oaks subdivision, watching the last innings of a baseball game on television. He's wearing a short-sleeved shirt, seersucker pants, dark socks, and leather loafers worn at the heel. That morning he had a haircut, so his neckline's a shade lighter than the rest of his flesh. Whiskers the colour of pig iron cling to his collar. Vince is 58 years old, a circuit court judge and retired Air Force colonel, and even in repose his bearing suggests a dignity and breeding uncommon in most. Lynn can also see her mother Margaret undressing in the master bedroom at the rear of the house. Margaret has removed her eyeglasses, her shoes, and her dress. Wearing only panties and a brassiere, she's staring at herself in the dresser mirror, at a body gone woefully soft. This is heartbreaking, this picture. Mother getting ready for bed. The quiet, enormous as it is, belies everything. If the killers simply appeared in the house, it was because Vince left a crack in the front door for his dogs Fritz and Mo to come and go. But more likely, one of them was a friend. Someone Vince would trust to let in at this time of night. So now Lynn hears the doorbell ring, sees Vince mute the television and get up from the couch. "Can I get you a cup of coffee or a soda before I sit down?" he says to the men at the door. Slowly they walk into the family room, and as Vince lifts his hands to repeat the question, he takes the first round in the face, just below the eye. The shooter's homemade silencer, taped over the barrel of a .22 caliber Ruger automatic, rains bits of foam across the room. Except for the dull whitening of his lips, the killer has betrayed no emotion. Now, as Vince falls back and encounters the floor, arterial blood sprays the walls in starts and stops. Vince strains to pull himself up, clutching at his favorite easy chair, a big yellow thing. His hands throb, red with powder burns. Margaret has heard nothing. And since without glasses she can't see very well, she thinks she recognizes the familiar shape and color of her husband at the bedroom door. She removes an earring, clutching it in her palm. The shooter steps closer, raises his gun, and fires high twice, throwing more white foam into the air, missing her head by inches. Does she fight him now? Does she speak? These are questions L'Insposito can't rightly answer. Neither this one. How must Margaret have felt to remove an earring one moment, and to stare into the face of her executioner the next? Together, the killer and the person who helped gain him entrance take their time walking back to the family room, back to Vince, who has managed to survive the initial headshot. On TV, a crowd roars, but no sound is heard. A man in pinstripes is pedaling around the bases, kicking orange dirt. The shooter lifts his hand and fires 2 more rounds into the judge, these entering the mouth. He had been so proud of his teeth, Vince had, so meticulous in his daily care of them, and now they scatter in pieces about the room. His poor teeth, Lynn mutters one day some 3.5 years after the fact. She shuts her eyes, but her voice is big and strong. Can you imagine how much that must have hurt? The Sherry murders represent a case study in Dixie Mafia tactics. At the heart are 2 convicted killers, Kirksey McCord Nix Junior and Bobby Joe Fabian, who are busy attacking each other's versions of the murder while trying to scam their way out of prison, or at least into better ones. Warily monitoring their accounts is Sposito, who has made it her crusade to see that the deaths of her parents aren't forgotten and filed away like so many Dixie Mafia slayings. The Biloxi sheriff, addressing reporters shortly after the night of September 14, 1987, said the Sherry's was the most sensational murder case in the history of the state. The death of Vince and Margaret had an impact on Biloxi that rivaled Hurricane Camille's 18 years before. Something was revealed about the town that people too often had dismissed or ignored. Biloxi was vulnerable to certain manic forces, natural or otherwise, or worse yet, it seemed to engender them. Until Lynn Sposito's private investigation into the murder of her parents suggested to the contrary, people who should have known better were saying that the Dixie Mafia was less a force than a memory, its ranks depleted by ugly deaths and interminable prison sentences. The gang had terrorized the Gulf Coast in the late 1960s and early 1970s, but the years since had been relatively quiet, a few ventures into prostitution, drug dealing, and gambling notwithstanding. In fact, the coast grew so sleepy that some lawmen began to argue that the Dixie Mafia never existed. They exist, sure enough, said a former FBI agent who claims to have tracked the gang for years. They just don't want you to know that they do. Unlike La Cosa Nostra, the Dixie Mafia is said to have no strict hierarchical structure or Italian heritage. Some public officials, such as Sheriff Leroy Hobbs, elected in 1971, not only condoned the mob's presence in the area, but seemed intent on becoming one of its major players. Once respected as a crusader dedicated to cleaning up Harrison County, Hobbs turned out to be a gambler who accepted payoffs from strip joint owners, frequented prostitutes, and befriended some of the Dixie Mafia's most feared thieves and killers. "You sold your soul to the devil," a judge admonished Hobbs, then slapped him with a 20-year prison sentence for racketeering. Today, only 3 strip joints continue to operate in Biloxi, all the others having been forced out of existence in the early 1980s. The survivors are the Golden Nugget and the Dream Room, both located across from the Krispy Kreme on Scenic Highway and the Horseshoe Lounge near downtown. They're owned by a thin-haired, weasel-looking old fellow named Mike Gillich Jr. And although he's yet to be convicted of a felony, Gillich, authorities say, is a Dixie Mafia kingpin. How he has managed to remain in business while all other club owners have been summarily shut down remains a subject of much public debate. But most agree it's because Gillich has managed to stay just inside the law with the help of some pretty powerful friends, among them the city's current mayor, Pete Halat, and Halat's former law partner, one Vincent Sherry Jr. This to remember about the late judge. He was different things to different people, and so was his wife. While the children of the Sherrys remember their father as being a devout Catholic who genuinely loved people and cared nothing about money, some townsfolk say he was a snooty intellectual, almost always out for personal gain. A crook himself, who not only represented gang members, but often hung out at Gillich's bars and flirted with the dancers. And while the children recall their mother, one of the first women ever to serve on the Biloxi City Council, as being a big-hearted idealist out to save the world, others contend that she was really a loud-mouthed rabble-rouser out to destroy whatever and whoever happened to dominate the political scene at the moment. If nothing else, Vince and Margaret were an odd match. A sometime lawyer for the mob married to one of its biggest enemies. They were the personification of the town's confused spirit, good and evil coexisting under the same roof. Which of them was good, and which evil depended on who you talked to in Biloxi. In death, they became symbols of a certain duplicity, casualties of a tradition that seems as integral a part of the place as college football and good old boy hunting clubs are elsewhere in the South. At the Sherry's wake, while hundreds of mourners turned out to look upon a pair of coffins that remained closed, a woman walked up to Lynn Sposito, eldest of the 4 Sherry children, and announced, "Honey, about 75% of the people in this town think Gerald Blessy had your parents killed. The other 25% are related to him." Gerald Blessy happened to be Biloxi's mayor at the time, and back in her city council days, Margaret had been his chief nemesis, fighting him at every turn. Blessy was a liberal Democrat with a degree from Harvard, Margaret a conservative Republican who often found herself coming up on the short end of 6-1 vote. While most regarded Blessy as a future star in state and perhaps even national politics, Margaret told her family that she thought he was crooked, paranoid, and mad. She also claimed to have been assisting the FBI in a covert investigation of a waterfront development project spearheaded by Blessy. In 1985, after her only term on the council ended, Margaret had waged a bitter mayoral campaign against Blessy and lost by 500 votes, and she was planning on challenging him again in 1989. "I've almost got enough here to put the bastard away," Margaret confided to friends in our "it'll blow the lid off the city." Another thing she'd been heard to say was, "When I'm elected mayor, I'm going to padlock Mike Gillich's clubs and run him out of town on a rail." A few days after the Sherry funeral, Blessy told reporters that the murders were a terrible tragedy, and that, although Margaret and I had robust political debates, these differences were about ideas. Of the rumours, he said, "It's a cloud over our city made darker by false witness. There is absolutely no proof and no reason to suggest that the mayor or any city official had anything to do with the death of these 2 people." It took about a week for investigators to determine that Gerald Blessy really did have nothing to do with the Sherry murders, but the FBI, in the meantime, had begun an investigation of his role in the waterfront project. Several months later, a federal grand jury indicted him and 4 others for conspiracy, extortion, and mail fraud. The Sherry children released this statement to the press. "After all the disparaging remarks aimed toward our mother, questioning not only her motivation and integrity, but at times her sanity, we cannot help but feel pleased that her dream for accountability in all levels of government did not die with her." The first of the federal cases against Blessy for conspiracy and mail fraud was declared a mistrial, and the case was later dismissed. And in the extortion trial held last year, he was found innocent. A year had passed since the murders, and they remained no less a mystery than they were the day Pete Hallett, who said he was wondering why Vince had not reported to work, shoved open the door at 203 Hickory Hill Circle and spotted the body of his friend lying in a pool of blood, gas bubbling in the places where the bullets had entered. To Lynn Sposito's thinking, some of the investigators were either too baffled or incompetent to solve the thing, and she wondered if maybe they were being influenced by political enemies of her parents. One day, an investigator with the sheriff's department pulled her aside and said, "Look, it might not have anything to do with your parents' death, but don't trust Pete." Apparently, Hallett had been drawn into question because of his association with Kirksey McCord Nix Junior, a murderer serving life without parole at the Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola. Nix, short, fat-bellied, and missing a circle of hair on the top of his head, wasn't a man whose mugshot inspired fear, but by all accounts, he was the most ruthless and hard-hearted soldier ever to run with the gang. "The man's evil," one source told me, "but he's also brilliant. The combination of the two makes him someone you don't want to fuck around with." Among other marks in his criminal career, it is said that Nix plotted the ambush of Walking Tall Sheriff Buford Pusser and his wife 24 years ago in McNairy County, Tennessee. Pauline Pusser died in the attack. Pusser himself managed to survive, with the bottom half of his face shot off. In 1972, Nix was sentenced to life without parole for killing a wealthy New Orleans businessman. But even while behind bars, he proved to be dangerous. He became one of Angola's most feared inmates, earning the sobriquets Master and Godfather. He commanded a goodly share of house mice, fellow prisoners, who in exchange for protection served as his slaves. When Lynn Sposito first heard of him, Nix was being investigated for allegedly running elaborate telephone scams from the Angola prison. He and his partners had reportedly accumulated more than $1 million, and the Hallett and Sherry law offices might have been involved. Lynn also learned that, in addition to being Nix's attorney, Pete Hallett was one of his best friends, and investigators believed Hallett might have played a part in the scams. Tired of what she perceived as foot-dragging on the part of law enforcement, Lynn solicited advice on what to do next. Friends told her about a former Mississippi Highway Patrol chief investigator, now in private business. Rex Armisted's $50,000 fee seemed a bit excessive, but he was said to be tough and thorough, an expert on the Dixie Mafia. They also told Lynn that Armisted had personally shot and killed in the neighborhood of a dozen outlaws, all in the line of duty. "I want this done legally," she said. "I don't want some mercenary on the loose jeopardizing the case." Intimidated by Armisted's reputation, she tape-recorded their telephone conversations and stored them in a safe deposit box at her bank. In the event of her death, she instructed her husband, these were to be turned over to the police. Lynn, her husband Dick, and their 3 children live in Raleigh, North Carolina, in a sprawling 2-story house standing high above a quiet strip of asphalt. The Saturday afternoon, Armisted arrived with Dick and pulled up the drive. A neighbor across the street was stationed at a darkened window, shooting pictures with a 35mm camera equipped with a telephoto lens. Lynn showed Armisted to the kitchen table. "Do you have any qualms about me working for you?" he said. "Yeah, I do. The way you've been portrayed to me is that you're a hitman for the cops." "Any trained law enforcement person would have done what I did," he replied, then rattled off stories about the 9 people he'd killed. Later that night, Lynn said, "Gerald Blessey should be our #1 suspect. He had a lot to lose, not only his political office, but HUD monies and that type of thing." She then named 2 others, Kirksey Nix and Peter Hallett. I keep hearing things. In February 1989, Armisted called. "I have a real problem," he told Lynn. "What is it?" "I can't get past Pete." "Rex," she told him, "I never asked you to get past anyone. I asked you to find out what happened." He waited a while before saying anything more. "You need to come down, Lynn. We need to talk." Rex Armistead, as it happened, had paid a visit to a jailbird named Bobby Joe Fabian, or Satin, as some of his old Dixie Mafia pals knew him. Armistead had helped bring Fabian to justice some 17 years before for killing a millionaire horse breeder in Tennessee and dumping his body in Mississippi. Fabian was now serving life without parole at Angola for an unrelated escapade he'd had with a couple of Louisiana cops. Apparently, Fabian and another fellow had kidnapped a state trooper and a town marshal, taken them out into a field, and shot them. On top of his reputation as a killer and long-standing member of the mob, Fabian was noted for being one of the most inventive con men who ever lived. At Angola, they said he could hustle the draws off the Blessed Virgin Mary. For years, Fabian had been trying to get out of the Louisiana prison system and into Mississippi's, where he would serve life plus 30 years for killing the horse breeder, and where visits with his wife would be allowed. In Mississippi, he would eventually be eligible for parole, whereas in Louisiana, he would certainly die on prison grounds. This seemed a lowly ambition at best, to move from one rotten hole to another. But Fabian had made it his life's work, pushing his family to appeal to everyone, from the governor of the state of Louisiana to the producers of 60 Minutes. Fabian related to Armistead that he, Kirksey Nix, and a few other inmates had been scamming homosexuals for a number of years. It was a sophisticated operation that had begun simply enough, with personal ads in gay newspapers and magazines. The ad, signed by a fictitious character named Eddie, read as follows: "Be my summer lover GWM, 23, 140, cute, slim, seeks sincere, warm relationship. Willing to relocate for the summer or permanently if love blooms. I'm romantic, cuddly, shy, and need someone special in my life. West Texas is too lonesome. I am ready to travel and have a torrid summer affair that may change both our lives for the better. Looks and age are not as important as what's inside. No phonies or druggies. I am straight acting and do not smoke. If you are for real, write now. I will answer all, but phone numbers first." Responses, numbering in the thousands, had come from all over the United States and as far away as New Zealand. Everyone, it had seemed, was willing to help provide Eddie with the summer fling he desired, and so the inmates, playing Cupid, went about the business of bringing the two parties together. One sucker, Bobby Joe Fabian later said, had lost in the vicinity of $200,000 trying to arrange a rendezvous with Eddie. And it had gotten to the point that the scam was bringing in so much money that it was tough keeping up with it all. Pete Halat, Fabian claimed, was assisting them from his law office in Biloxi, and lately they had turned to him when $500,000 of their earnings was missing. According to Fabian, Halat had met with him, Nix, and another prisoner in the visiting shed at Angola in March 1987. Asked by Nix where the money was, Halat had replied that his law partner Vince Sherry had swung with it. Although Fabian believed that Halat was the one responsible for stealing the money, the inmates and Halat had then plotted to kill the judge. After all, it wasn't as if they could resort to legal means for punishing such a theft. Nix had recommended someone named John Elbert Ransom for the job, and Fabian had made the necessary phone call. Ransom was a bespectacled 60-year-old grandfather from Smyrna, Georgia. He also was one of the Dixie Mafia's most notorious hitmen. Over the years, Ransom had amassed a slew of arrests, most of them firearms violations, and he'd even lost a leg to a shotgun blast in a barroom brawl. His step might have been a little crooked, but no one ever doubted John Ransom's aim. "Why, the man has his very own graveyard," was what Fabian said about him. The day Rex Armistead told Lynn Sposito about his interview with Bobby Joe Fabian, Pete Halat, the man she believed to be at least partially responsible for her parents' murder, was preparing to hold a fundraiser for his mayoral campaign. That Pete Halat happened to be her father's best friend and former partner made her weep for all that was lost and unfair in this world. Not long after going public with his account of the Sherry murders, Bobby Joe Fabian told authorities that Kirksey McCord Nix Junior had put 3 concurrent contracts out on his life, and that all had been accepted by Angola inmates. If he wasn't moved immediately from the prison, Fabian said, surely he would be dead in a number of days, and the Sherry case would be short its star witness. Eventually, Fabian was moved to Mississippi as part of a deal for his testimony. While ensuring his safety, the government had granted him what he'd been trying to obtain for years. Before Angola put a stop to the scamming, prisoners had called Fabian Mr. AT&T because he spent so much time on the phone. "Kirksey Nix wants me dead," Mr. AT&T tells me one day, calling from the Simpson County Jail. "At Angola, these dudes came up to me and asked if I wanted them to kill him, and I said, nah, leave him alone. Nix, when you meet him, he wants you to say, 'Oh, my lord, it's an honor to meet you, Mr. Nix. I'm so privileged to be in your presence.'" That's what he tried to inject in the inmates over there, but they looked at him like he was a piece of shit. His life dream is to be the godfather, but I used to tell him, "You can't do nothing but be the godmother, Kirksey." A few days before, Nix had taken a polygraph test and was questioned about Sherry's murder. The examiner, summoned to the prison by Nix and his attorney, had determined that Nix had no guilty knowledge, nor did he participate in any way in the murders of Judge Vincent Sherry or his wife, Margaret. "We was laughing about that test on this end," Fabian says. "You see, Nix has always bragged that he could beat any lie detector test anyway. The trick is to take Valiums and stuff, or any kind of depressant. He's the kind of dude who believes so strongly in what he says. He can tell a lie about you, and stand there and expect you to verify it. Back in the joint he wanted to say that we robbed armored car joints and shit to look tough. I'd laugh at him, see? What I wonder now, why didn't he take a lie detector test for the FBI or the state police? This way his lawyer can rig the questions, and you ask him 3 or 4 different ways." "Would Fabian consent to a similar test?" I ask. "Couldn't pass it," he says. "If you ask me did I kill Abraham Lincoln, I'd be guilty. I'm what you call hypertensive. That's why those tests are so full of shit." Several months ago, Fabian was diagnosed as having diabetes, and only lately, he says, "My liver has started acting up, and something the size of a golf ball is growing under my arm." He was also experiencing chest pains, he says, and there were days when I can't see and everything. "I got trouble with my circulation, and I'm building up a lot of fluid. If something doesn't happen soon, I don't think I'll last much longer, and they know that." A few days later, he calls back and sounds no better. He says he'd like to see his wife, Vera, whom he describes as being practically barefoot out on the street. She doesn't have lights or gas or a phone. Frankly, I don't know how she's making it. And he wonders if I might consider driving her over. "If they know you're a writer, they won't let you see me. Tell them we're related. You can be my brother or something. They won't give a shit." He insists that Vera and I bring cigarettes. Trustees, he claims, are selling a single pack for as much as $10, and he's already bartered 2 wedding rings to get some. He's starting to feel desperate, like death is near. He has all but abandoned his dream of building a 4,000-man privately run prison when he gets out. He had also dreamed of writing 2 or 3 books about the scams and the Dixie Mafia, telling what's fact and what isn't, and making a fortune when they hit the bestseller list. A week later, I am driving his wife Vera from her home in southern Louisiana to the town of Mendenhall in south-central Mississippi. At the jail, a sheriff's deputy announces that smoking is prohibited in the cells, and so Vera has to empty her pockets of the 4 packs of Camels she brought, and now she's worried what her husband will say about being denied his smokes. "Sometimes I wonder if he loves them more than me," she says. "Bobby and those cigarettes." Because Fabian is considered high risk, a female officer escorts Vera into a room and strip searches her, checking every orifice large enough to hold a weapon. Then 2 male deputies do the same to me. "Take all your clothes off," one says. "Your underwear too, and bend over." Half an hour later, Fabian appears, shuffling into the front office accompanied by 2 guards. He's wearing a party animal t-shirt, gym shorts and flip-flops. His face is swollen, and his stomach's so big it's formed a shelf for his chin. He and Vera embrace in front of the deputies, and then he says, "You made it," and puts an arm around me. "My brother-in-law," he tells the guards. "He made it." They show us into a visiting room, and he and Vera sit next to each other. "They're trying to kill me," Fabian says. "I swear, baby, they're all trying to kill me." "I know, Bobby," Vera answers. "I know." An hour later, a guard raps on the door, and Vera and Bobby Joe Fabian are led into the lobby. "Thanks for bringing Vera," Fabian says, and puts his hand in mine. 3 weeks after being sworn in as mayor in July 1989, Pete Halat, his wife Sandra, and some of their friends were having dinner in celebration of his 47th birthday. It was one of those nights when the food is good, the liquor potent, and the talk of things eternal, and so no one was surprised when Halat, inspired by the moment, rose to his feet and announced, "I don't think I've ever been happier in my entire life." A few days after Halat's birthday party, a Jackson television reporter named Ed Bryson approached the mayor for an interview. Bryson had recently interviewed a source who'd given him information about the Sherry murders, and he wondered if Halat might consider answering certain questions that had been raised. Halat consented, and promptly found himself battling charges that in time would threaten his political career, push him near bankruptcy, and devastate his family and friends. Bryson, steady and deferential in his approach, pitched the allegations brought forth by Bobby Joe Fabian, whom he respectfully referred to as a Louisiana inmate. An outright lie was how Halat replied to Fabian's principal charge that he had ordered the hit on Vince Sherry. The next day, Halat found himself standing before a room crowded with reporters, defending himself in a voice choked with rage. Blood pooled darkly in his face. Halat was to argue that though he'd never been charged with a crime, here he was defending his name against a Louisiana prisoner who also happened to be one of the world's greatest con men. Pete Halat might have expected things to come to this. Several months before, in April, Lynn Sposito had informed the press that she and her family no longer wanted the Sherry name associated with Halat's mayoral campaign. Contrary to the beliefs of many, the family had declared in a widely circulated statement, "A vote for Pete Halat is not a vote for Margaret Sherry." Since then, Lynn and her family had waged nothing short of war against him. They claimed, for example, that his stirring eulogy at their parents' funeral had come uninvited. Lynn also told reporters that one day in Halat's office he had wagged a finger in her face and defended his Dixie Mafia friends. "Kirksey Nix has been a client of mine since 1979. He is also a friend of mine. He's a friend of Mike Gillich's and once worked for Mike Gillich. And Mike Gillich is a friend of mine. He always has been, he always will be. Do you hear what I'm saying, girl?" A few minutes later, she approached him in the firm's library. "I don't give a good goddamn if you're friends with the devil, Pete, just as long as it didn't have anything to do with my parents' killing. If it did, I hope to God you all fry." Halat told a different story. "I may have said Mike Gillich was my friend, but I certainly didn't put my finger in her face. I would never do that." Even after Fabian emerged as Halat's chief accuser and Rex Armistead disappeared from view, Lynn continued her private investigation of the murders, often flying down to the coast and talking to people with more leads to pursue. She became something of an authority on the Dixie Mafia and often named triggermen in murders that had never been solved. Her jealous approach rankled many, and the comment from one observer that she was a nut worse really than her mother was not uncommon. Mike Gillich refused to comment publicly about her accusations, but his lawyer, Albert Nicaise, said, "Lynn talks about Mike Gillich, but if you dig deep enough, you'll find that at one time Vince Sherry actually represented Mike Gillich on some things. Some injunction where they were trying to close him down for lewdness or whatever. Now, Vince Sherry, you'll also find that he represented some folks that I know were worse than Mike Gillich." Chasing leads, Lynn also learned that Nix had called the Halat and Sherry law offices 147 times in the 2 months after the murders. On the day Lynn's parents were slain, Nix called once and spoke for only 1 minute. And on the day the bodies were found, Halat's office received 4 calls from Angola. Did this suggest that Nix was calling for confirmation that the contract had been fulfilled? Lynn believed it did. "You have to understand the manner in which you make a call to an inmate," Halat argued. "You have to call the prison and tell them that you're going to put in a call at a certain time, or that you'd like the prisoner to call you. I spoke to the guy a lot, but I've never tried to deny that or hide it." While rumors circulated along the coast that it was only a matter of time before Pete Halat was called into court and asked to explain himself, the mayor's office found itself overwhelmed with phone calls and letters of support. "When this is all over and done with," Halat said, "the only people who will have been scammed are the taxpayers, the U.S. attorney, and the folks who sat on the jury." To this, Lynn Sposito responded, "If Pete's innocent, then I want to know how in the hell they got all these people to set him up. And if Pete is innocent, that means we've still got a killer to find." She also said, "At some point I'm going to die too, and I'll see my parents, and I don't want to say I didn't do enough to find whoever it was who killed them." The armed guard opens the door, and Kirksey Nix shows himself. Cuffed and shackled, he hops into the visiting room and lowers himself onto a chair. Through the metal screen, his face is a shivering moon framed by glasses. He's wearing a soiled white jumpsuit, a gold chain, and several gold rings. There's a sweaty stink to him, dark and gamey. Kirksey Nix, most believe, has the answers to the Sherry murders. A resident of the scam tier, a closely monitored section even more restrictive than death row, Nix goes days without talking to anyone but his guards. And rarely do they feel like bothering. Nix is straining now to see through the dense metal grid that separates him from his interviewer. I ask him to talk about the Dixie Mafia, and he laughs a little sadly to himself. "If there really is a Dixie Mafia," he says, "I don't know where it is, and they never paid me. They owe me a lot of money." He seems amused by his response and pauses before continuing. "What happened is, in 68 or 69, the Law Enforcement Assistance Act was passed by the Nixon administration. They were giving away in excess of $1 billion, and a number of their grants targeted organized crime. Police agencies in Tupelo, Mississippi and Lawton, Oklahoma, for example, might have had a hard time demonstrating they had an Italian organized crime problem. But because a lot of southern agencies were interested in that money, they applied the name Dixie Mafia to some of us, when most of the time we didn't know each other until we read about our associations in the newspaper. We were all in our 20s, and suddenly there we were being described as mafia dons. We were young, and when you're young you have a certain amount of ego connected. It's self-fulfilling in that regard, because the people targeted tried to emulate the image. In the 1960s, Nix excelled as a card mechanic at some of the strip joints on the Gulf Coast, ripping off tourists and servicemen. At one time, he says, he worked for Mike Gillich, an old friend. "I saw in the paper the other day that he was the Dixie Mafia kingpin. Well, some time ago he was an associate, then he was a member, then now that he's been targeted, he's a kingpin. If you look closely, the same thing happened to me." Although Nix's highest hourly wage at Angola has been 2 cents, the death of his father in 1979 yielded him a considerable inheritance. He used some of the money to buy a house in Ocean Springs, Mississippi, just east of Biloxi. Pete Hallett's wife, Sandra, was the real estate agent who handled the deal, and through her Nix and Hallett became acquainted. Hallett had arranged the 1983 telephone marriage between Nix and Nix's stepdaughter, Kelly Dawn Newman. He continued to serve as Nix's attorney until a few years ago, when he learned that Nix was the target of an extortion probe, and dropped him. Pete Hallett, Nix is saying, was never involved in any scams. His office, to my knowledge, was never involved in any scams, and he's never done anything illegal or unethical for me. I regret that his kindness or business relationship with me has caused him distress. This gentleman went from being at the pinnacle of Gulf Coast society to being stigmatized by a person, Bobby Fabian, who has no credibility at all. Nix pulls at his cuffs and chains as he defends the honor of Hallett, Gillich, and Ransom, whom he describes as people you can sit and talk to. At the time of this meeting, Ransom was locked up in a Georgia prison serving a 12-year sentence for a manslaughter conviction that occurred some 2 years after the Sherrys were killed, a hit, law enforcement people say, that was remarkably similar to the hit on the Sherrys. You're going to have to make a decision, Nix says now. You're going to have to decide whether you believe Bobby Fabian or whether you think he's full of bull. Now, if you decide that his story's fantasy, as I know it to be, then you'll have to understand that people like John Ransom come into play because they're associated with me. When a person makes a con, the con has to contain convincers. The convincer is the blood that spills out of your mouth, for example, to show that you've been badly hurt. If you don't have something to convince the victim of the con game, then you can't convince him. Bobby Fabian has to weave through his story certain convincers, or things that they can check on that are true. Which is what the U.S. attorney did. Now he, the attorney, can't very well after all these years and hundreds of thousands of dollars spent say, well, you know, folks, who would ever think it, but this Bobby Joe Fabian has made a damn fool out of me. Do you think he wants to admit that he's been conned? This man is a political animal, and he's got to hope that he'll break this case some way. And so, what if, in the process, Kirksey Nix gets hanged? Who'll care? They've already demonized me. Nix leans closer to the screen, his head tilted forward. The scams had nothing to do with the Sherry murders, he says. Think about it. If you and I and Bobby Fabian are conning, would you let me hold your share of $500,000? Do you think Bobby Fabian would let me hold his share? Now put yourself in his shoes, with 2 life sentences here and another one owed in Mississippi. And you have parole in Mississippi. But you have none here. Think of the hopelessness he must have felt over his 2 life sentences for shooting those police officers. Stuck here in a Louisiana prison, knowing you'll never get out. Now doesn't Mississippi look attractive to you? Nix stands and holds his back against the wall. The guard is at the door, ready to take him back to his cell. It's ironic, Nix says, his voice a worn, wilted thing. I've never denied being a con man. Never. And yet I've never had such a difficult time trying to refute a more flagrant story. The guard leads him out into a hallway, and I see now what a small, pinched figure he cuts. Godfather or godmother, he'll die here, and he knows it. No one will remember his name. People will always believe a lie before they believe the truth, he says. If there's one thing I've discovered, it's that. But I've got to give it to Bobby Joe Fabian. He's the best man. He's the absolute best. A few weeks later in the spring, federal marshals transferred Kirksey Nix from Angola to Biloxi to face drug charges unrelated to the Sherry case. He pleaded innocent and told the U.S. magistrate that he was glad to be back on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. It had been 14 years since his last visit, and he marveled at the size of the pine trees growing in the median of the highway. In April, Nix decided he wanted a taste of some local seafood. Weary of Angola's Cajun mudbugs, hard-boiled red beans and rice, and jambalaya pie, he claimed in a motion filed in U.S. District Court that he had been subjected to cruel and unusual punishment because he had been denied a repast of Gulf Coast seafood. Nix seemed to be having a lot of fun, but then in May a 4-count federal indictment was unsealed in Jackson, accusing him, Gillich and Ransom of conspiracy and wire fraud in connection with the scams. Also named was Nix's former girlfriend, Lorraine Sharp, who had once worked in Pete Halat's office. Nix, Gillich and Ransom were indicted under a federal murder-for-hire statute and for aiding and abetting a murder contract on the Sherrys. The grand jury investigation had lasted 21 months, and, although the allegations listed in the indictments departed somewhat from Fabian's testimony, it was clear that the federal prosecutors had relied heavily on it. Pete Halat has not been indicted, and his alleged Angola meeting with Nix and Fabian was not mentioned. The trial date was set for this month. Fabian by now had been moved to another county jail, this one in Canton, Mississippi. He called me one night and said he was thrilled about the news, and that he'd requested a written statement from the U.S. attorney saying that when the last jury goes out, I go out with them, win, lose, or draw. If they don't help me, I'll have to blow up. I asked what this meant, and he replied, "Well, I just won't testify. The whole case is built around me, and without me they can't win. After the trial, I want them to relocate my wife and give me my freedom." He laughed and said, "For all I'm doing for them, they should give me about $100,000 and a Rolls Royce too, but I'm not greedy." Fabian paused and considered his future. It was full of possibilities, even he had to admit. He was smart and not yet old. He possessed certain talents that, with a little luck, might take him far in the world. And another thing, wherever he was likely to go, he wouldn't need much money. The Dixie Mafia, after all, takes especially good care of its own. The end.